Well, greetings, Imagination Connoisseurs. Once again, it is I, your sanctimoniously notorious host, Robert Meyer Burnett, here for Robservations, the show about something. Robservations live chat number 190. I want to say welcome to all of you Imagination Connoisseurs, you members of this, the Post-Geek Singularity community, the most hospitable community on the web, as I'm sure yesterday's chat can attest to. Oh my God, you know what I figured we'd do today? I figured we'd talk about abortion, we'd talk about same-sex marriage, we'd talk about gun control. No, I'm kidding. We're not going to talk about those things. We could, but we're not going to. Today, we are going to talk about everything old is new again. We are going to talk about the very core tenets of this channel, which is basically science fiction, fantasy, and horror in all of its myriad forms and how awesome it all is. That is correct. And of course, these chats are brought to you by Lucky Tiger products for those men who want to look good and feel great. And if you go to their website, getluckytiger.com, you, after buying a lot of their great products, and by the way, once again, I recommend their facial scrub made with bamboo, and also their all-over body wash that was stolen by Elizabeth's eldest teen daughter, Zoe Trope, who has yet to give it back, even though I've mentioned it to her on numerous occasions. I'm sure she's used it all up, but that's okay. But you can go to their website at getluckytiger.com. You can punch in PGS when you check out for Post-Geek Singularity, and you can get 20% off of your order. So anyway, yesterday I admit I provocatively put my toe into some political subjects. A lot of people might not have, everyone got acrimonious. Somebody wrote to me, they said, they put a comment on yesterday's chat saying, "You are not the person I thought you were. I am leaving." And I was like, wait a minute, you've watched 188 chats, and on chat number 189, I say something that bothered you and you're going to leave, which bothers me. I don't want to make anyone leave. But let me just say, first of all, my first and foremost concern here is I'm presenting ideas. I don't expect you to agree with me 100%, but what I want to do is create a dialogue. We're supposed to have cogent, interesting dialogue, and we're supposed to have a place that is free and open where we can all share our ideas about many different things without jumping down each other's throats. And that's what I think that this channel is supposed to be all about. But it is, I get it. People have a lot of strong feelings about what's been going on in the country, around the world, but I didn't mean to set everyone off. Well, maybe a little, but keep it a little provocative. And someone else had accused me a couple days ago saying, all you talk about Star Trek too much on your channel. And I'm like, dude, guilty has charged. I've talked about Star Trek too much in my life. So it's not surprising that I wouldn't talk about it a lot on this channel either. But anyway, today's chat is not about politics yet. Even though I do think that all storytelling, to a certain extent, anytime you're examining human behavior, which is what, after all stories are about. All stories are contextually about making sense of the world around us, the human truths of existence. And that's what all stories are about. So all stories are inherently political in some way. I think when people say politics now, there's a few hot button issues that they don't want to talk about, which I think we should be talking about them all the time. We just need to learn how to be more mature where we can discuss them and not get so, turn into like a mad creature. We should, be able to discuss issues respectfully. But anyway, I am not here to get all political on you today. I promise. I can see Terry, my moderator, Terry in the UK is going, wiping the sweat from his brow. Terry does a great job. But, although I'm going to read a letter that Terry wrote that I vehemently disagree with about the Netflix documentary, The Great Hack. You see, I can love Terry. He can be a moderator on this channel, and I can respectfully disagree with what he has to say, which we will talk about later. And although it is a great letter, I have to say, much appreciated him sending that in. So the thing that I wanted to talk about today, and by the way, I just pulled the Day the Earth Stood Still, the thumbnail for this chat, because Day the Earth Stood Still, when I think about classic science fiction movies that people need to watch, it's either Day the Earth Stood Still or Forbidden Planet. Those are usually the two films that people have not watched. And anybody who likes Star Trek, I'm like, oh, you haven't seen Forbidden Planet, which is sort of the prototype for all of Star Trek, really. But anyway, this letter, I want to start off by reading a letter. Yes, this letter comes in from Joel Nicholson, and I think it's a great letter. It's one of my favorite kinds of letters to read because, well, you'll see. Joel writes, "Hey Rob, love the YouTube channel and have been watching recently. The reason I'm emailing today is I want to know, is there anything from TV, films, and books that you only ever got into later in life and that you regretted not getting into earlier? I'll give you two personal examples. Well, one, Star Trek, the original series. For many pop culture references, I'd always been aware of Star Trek. Unfortunately, due to me being lazy or maybe lack of reruns on the BBC, I'd never actually watched Star Trek, nor knew any friends who did. Finally, 6 years ago, I subscribed to Netflix and used a VPN to access the American content." Shame on you. "After searching for something to watch, I came across Star Trek. I thought I'd give it a go, and I was hooked instantly. I don't know whether this is said about the show, but I felt a certain warmth about it. The characters weren't strangers, but were friends I had yet to meet." I love that. "The storylines were thought-provoking, and being a fan of the old Doctor Who, I could appreciate the appearance of the show. How I wish I'd seen it as a child." 2, Stephen King. Although this is a very broad thing to talk about, Stephen King is more than just horror. In university, an English literature friend of mine got me into Stephen King. We'd talk about the movie adaptations we'd like of his work, and after some talking, my friend got me to read Misery as the first King novel to read. Needless to say, I binge read this, and after I started to read through his work chronologically, even reading his nonfiction work. Side note, King's books on writing and Danse Macabre are great. If you're a fan of the horror genre, Danse Macabre is a must-read. Hopefully, he'll do an updated version, including the 80s until now. I'm still yet to read all of his works, but from Salem's Lot to It to The Stand, this man has created a world I wish I'd read at an early age. Thank you for the time to read my message. I hope to hear from your experience. Kind regards, Joel. Okay. I'll flat out say, Joel, I loved this letter, and I loved what you're saying. Now, one of, I think, the great joys in being an imagination connoisseur in this day and age is we have a rich history of science fiction, fantasy, and horror, movies, literature, television to delve into. As a matter of fact, I don't think in our lifetimes we don't have enough time to see it all, which is phenomenal. It's just a great state of affairs if you're a fan, because there's always something to watch. And if you're not adverse to looking into the past and writing off old movies, I mean, here's the thing. When I was growing up, when I was a kid, I mean, I was a kid in the 70s and in the 80s, and I think I didn't have any kind of a prejudice about whether films were old or not. Like, I knew that, for instance, the Universal Monster movies, the original, Frankenstein, Dracula, the Wolfman, the Invisible Man, Creature from the Black Lagoon, basically spanned a time beginning in the early 30s into the 50s. They were black and white. There was no, in my mind, that was the reality. And I wasn't not going to watch them. As a kid, they would air on television. I remember I was terrified the first time I saw the original Frankenstein, when you watch the arm like crawling across the disembodied arm crawling across the table. This scared the hell out of me. And it never occurred to me that I wouldn't watch something because it was old. I just assumed, I just knew that that was the reality of it. And I've said this before, but I'm going to say it again. When I was a kid, when you would get up before school on our independent television station, they would run Our Gang shorts. Alfalfa and Darla and Buckwheat. These were shorts in the 1930s. And we would watch them before school. I'd watch that in Star Blazers or Space Battleship Yamato 2199. That Imagination Connoisseur Norman Lau says he can't get into the new versions. Norman, keep watching. It's the same thing about people watching Babylon 5, the first season. But so you'd watch Our Gang shorts from the 30s. Then you would come home from school, and there was like a 3-hour block of time between 3 o'clock and 6 o'clock where they would have sitcoms from the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. So you could watch Leave It to Beaver, My Three Sons, I Dream of Jeannie, Gilligan's Island, Brady Bunch, Partridge Family. So in one day, as a kid, you basically were watching 40 years of American pop culture. The 40s, the 1940s weren't usually represented at the time, but the 30s, the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s were. So in one day, I was exposed, on a normal school day, I was exposed to 40 years of American pop culture. And I never thought to myself, well, I'm not going to watch Leave It to Beaver or something like the Andy Griffith Show because it's not in color. The reality was they were only in black and white, and it never occurred to me not to watch them because they were black and white. You just understood that, okay, these are from a different era. Now, admittedly, it was the 1970s and 80s. Dudes. I always say, I joke, I have one foot in the grave. Well, I do. I'm an old man, but I'm young at heart. And the thing is, I grew up in a time where it was never a consideration as to whether or not I would watch something based on when it came out. I've shown movies I remember once Elizabeth's daughter, Sophie, she could tell if a movie was old based on the film, the way the film stock, she didn't know it was the film stock she was commenting on, but it was. There are certain film stocks. If you watch films of the 1970s, for instance, the way film stocks looked, you can actually go, okay, this movie was made in the 70s. You can tell. Sophie was keyed in on that. She understood. She's like, wow, this movie's really old, based on, she didn't understand, nor would I expect her to, because who would? But she did understand that the colors and the film grain were not modern, and she could comment on that. But when I was growing up, that concern wasn't the case. And one of the great joys, so to back up, I wasn't prejudicial against when something came out. As I've said on the show many times before, when I was 5 years old, my favorite movie was George Powell, Byron Haskin directed The War of the Worlds that came out in 1953, which was saturated in color. And of course, you could see the wires on the Martian War Machine. If you watch the new 4K restoration you can get on iTunes, you can't see that. But I never would not watch War of the Worlds because it was made 25 years. Well, actually, it wasn't made 25 years. It was made actually 14 years before I was born. But when I started watching, it was like 20 years before I was born. So I wouldn't not watch something because it was not of my time. It was a science fiction film, and I would watch it, science fiction, horror, fantasy. I would watch anything, and I would judge it based on its own merits. Do I like this? I wasn't prejudicial against anything. So my life as an imagination connoisseur has always been formed by things of every era. You know, I remember after seeing War of the Worlds, it wasn't until way later that I read H.G. Wells' original novel, War of the Worlds, which is set in Victorian England. I didn't know that. You know, I didn't really understand until I read that book that, oh, you know, the Martian war machines were tripods. And in America, they just look like these floating. As a kid, I didn't understand they were being held aloft by 3 electromagnetic legs. You know, I didn't get that. So as a kid, I would watch anything, whether it was old or new. It did not matter. I had to see it all. I mean, I really had to see it all. I mean, that was the thing. That's what I would do. So what Joel's asking, I said Jack Nicholson, what Joel Nicholson is saying is interesting, because now, whenever you're born, you think you're the only generation. And it's really difficult when the generations that come after you have a hard time, at least I do, conceiving of the fact that wouldn't they just discover things the same way that I did? Well, no. As I've talked about on the show, I give pop culture 20-year shelf life. So say you're born 30 years ago in 1989, the summer that Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade came out, the summer of Tim Burton's Batman, the summer of Star Trek V, The Final Frontier, the summer of License to Kill, the James Bond film. I mean, if you were born 30 years ago, you're already 3 films into the Indiana Jones franchise. And you're probably not even going to watch Indiana Jones. You might watch it if you had tolerant parents. You might watch it when, say, you're 8, and that would mean you watched it in 97 for the first time. So if you're 30 years old now, you weren't even watching Raiders of the Lost Ark or Star Wars probably until the mid to the late 90s. So there's a lot of pop culture you missed. And I would say, to answer Joel's question, one of the great joys of when I went to USC, it's funny, this is chat number 190 of Robservations. When I went to USC, I transferred in as a senior, but I had to go back and take like freshman film courses. Cinema 190, taught by Drew Casper, which is a very famous course at USC. Drew Casper was a very famous teacher. I think he's still there. I'm not sure. But in Drew Casper's Cinema 190 course, I saw three classic movies for the first time. Now, one of them, the first movie he showed, was Singing in the Rain. I owned Singing in the Rain on Laserdisc because I had to buy it because it was a classic, but I never watched my Laserdisc. I owned Singing in the Rain, never watched it. Kind of like right now, I own Sound of Music, but never watched it. So I saw Singing in the Rain for the very first time in Drew Casper's Cinema 190, blown away how good it was. Loved Singing in the Rain. There's a reason why it's a classic. But there were 2 other movies that really stuck out to me that I saw. One was Robert Altman's Nashville. I saw that in Cinema 190. Never saw a Robert Altman film before. I might have caught a little bit of MASH, but nothing registered with me. I mean, I was 21. I saw Nashville, and I saw a movie that literally changed my life again, a movie that told me how great screenwriting could actually be, and that was All About Eve. Joseph Mankiewicz's All About Eve. Now, here's the thing. It is no surprise that All About Eve was a great film. It won Best Picture in 1950. It's considered one of the great classics of cinema. Well, I didn't see this movie until 1988. All About Eve came out in 1950. Never saw it, never caught up with it, probably because I wasn't interested. I was blown away. And it was funny because I saw the movie at USC. There's a big, huge movie theater, an actual real movie theater, great cinema on campus called Norris. And I remember when it was over, I was so blown away. I was just sitting there watching All About Eve. The lights come up, and I'm the last person left in the theater. And Drew Casper was standing at his podium where he lectured from at the bottom left of the screen where his podium was. And he was just kind of looking at me, just nodding his head. And it was like we were sharing a moment because he could tell I was completely captivated. From the beginning of George Sanders as his character, Addison DeWitt, is narrating this movie. I love this film. Now, that movie was, how old was it? It was 1950 to 1988. It was 38 years old then. First time I ever saw it, blew me away. Blown away. I was like, this is still to this day, if you ask me, what are some of the great screenplays that have ever been written? All About Eve would top that list. I believe it's one of the great screenplays ever written. So I hadn't seen that before. Now, I want to talk about Joel. He talked about discovering Stephen King. I love Stephen King. I've read almost all of his books, but the first Stephen King book that I encountered was his book of short stories, Night Shift. Now, it came out as, I didn't get the hardcover, it came out as a Signet paperback. Now, the book was published in February of 1978. So I would assume that when the paperback came out, had to have been, I don't know the exact date. I just did a cursory glance on the internet. Couldn't find out when the paperback was released, but I would say, let's just say it was 6 months later, maybe it was later. I don't know, but I would assume 78, which means I was either in the 5th or 6th grade when it came out, because my 5th grade year was 77 to 78. So it was June of 78. So I would assume I was in the 6th grade when I first read Stephen King. And it was Night Shift. And the original paperback had a blue cover and a die-cut cover where you saw eyes popping out. And I think it was the story I Am the Doorway, which is why I think. So anyway, that was the first time I read Stephen King. Now, I already loved horror books. I was reading horror novels. I think I remember Revenge of the Manitou, which was the sequel, Graham Masterton's sequel to The Manitou, is what really I started reading wholly inappropriate books. When I was in the 4th grade, 5th grade, I was reading books with extreme sex and violence in them. And I'll admit it, they were turn-ons to me. But Stephen King blew me away. Night Shift blew me away. And as a result of Night Shift, I went back and was able to get Salem's Lot, was able to get The Shining and Carrie, and read them. And it's interesting because in Night Shift, and I honestly, I didn't know this until just today. I'd never looked into it. But I thought that Night Shift were relatively recent stories when it was released. But if you look at like I Am the Doorway was originally published in 1971 in Cavalier magazine. I think it was a men's magazine. Battleground, which was one of my favorite stories in Night Shift, September 1972 issue of Cavalier. Quitters Incorporated, part of Cat's Eye, was unpublished. It was first published in Night Shift. I Know What You Need was published in 1976 in Cosmopolitan magazine. The Last Rung on the Ladder, which my friend Jim Cole adapted as a movie. It was a dollar baby. That was previously unpublished. The Woman in the Room, which became a story, Frank Darabont's first film that he made, previously unpublished. Lot of all of these things were published between 1969 and 1977. It was amazing. Now, things like I Say All About Eve is what Joel's asking, the things that I came to late in life. I would say all of the classic science fiction films that I watched, whether it was Destination Moon, all the George Powell movies, Destination Moon, War of the Worlds, Conquest of Space, and When Worlds Collide, all 50s. I hadn't seen those until the 70s, Sci-Fi theater. The original Planet of the Apes, which changed my life when I was 5 or 6, came to that late. A lot, Forbidden Planet, Day the Earth Stood Still, Them, Godzilla, all of these films that Zardoz came later in life. All of the classic science fiction. Fritz Lang's Metropolis, 1927. I probably saw that when I was a teenager for the first time. I mean, which would have been in the early 80s, early mid 80s, early 80s probably. So what's amazing is what I have discovered is that most of the things that are considered classic in terms of science fiction, fantasy, and horror are all really pretty great. There's a reason why they're considered classics. And whenever I would come to something new, to this day, it's true, as a middle-aged man with one foot in his grave, whenever I would come to something new or something I haven't seen before, I sit down and try and watch it with fresh eyes, as if this is, well, it is the first time I've seen it, but I think that, okay, I don't sit there and go, this might be considered a classic, but well, we'll just wait and see. I usually go into things thinking, okay, well, if it's supposed to be a classic, it probably is. And I've discovered more often than not that these classic films do, in fact, turn out to be classics. Sometimes I just have an aversion. I'm sure I'll love Sound of Music when and if I ever sit down and watch the film. Yes, I will watch it. But there's a reason why things have endured. And when you go and look at the AFI top 100 films of all time, there's a reason why they're there. And I think your life will be more enriched if you sit down and you don't think, oh, it's black and white, so I'm not going to watch it. Or I don't like the film stock. Look, you got to sit down. And I think it's a weird phenomenon. When I was a kid, no one ever said, well, I'm not going to watch that movie because it was old. It was so weird. We didn't grow up thinking that way. It's like, man, Frankenstein's on. That kicks ass. I get to see it again. You know, we never Hammer horror movies. Nobody said, oh, they're just cheap and low budget. Nobody said that stuff. We just watched things for what they were. You know, you get more discerning. You're like, you know, looking back, the James Bond movie You Only Live Twice has some pretty shoddy effects work. So I might enjoy From Russia with Love more because it has more verisimilitude. I didn't think that way when I was a kid. I was watching everything. I was enjoying it. And I wish more people felt that way. But we live in a different world now. I understand. The real problem, the real difference from when I was a child, get off my lawn. What happened? What's changed is now if you don't like something in the first 5 minutes, you turn it off. You know, you click on your browser and move to something else. But when we were kids back in the day, when we walked 20 miles to school in the snow, no, what we would do is you would watch something. Like I would sit down and wait. I would wait 2 hours to get that blast of monster fighting in a Godzilla movie, or I would wait to get one jolt from a made-for-TV horror film, or I would wait to see spaceships. I would sit there. I did not have, my attention span was long. I would watch and wait to get that just little injection of joy that I would get from any bit of genre entertainment. I would, man. And it would, if I didn't turn it off, because you had 3 TV stations and you had a PBS station and 2 independent stations. We literally had 6 stations growing up. And whenever I saw a science fiction, fantasy, or horror film, whether I liked it or not, I would watch that stuff from beginning to end. Even when I first got a VCR in 1980, I would rent movies and I would watch them all because I would try and figure out like what's going on, what's happening. As a total aside, apropos of nothing, one of the very first pre-recorded video cassettes I ever owned was on Allied Artists Home Entertainment, and it was Alfred Soul's movie Alice, Sweet Alice, or known as Communion. Now, it was one of the first 5 pre-recorded video cassettes I ever owned. This week, Arrow put out a beautiful edition of Alice, Sweet Alice on Blu-ray. Now, I don't even remember even ordering this disc, to be honest. It was one of those things, I'm sure when they first announced it, I just ordered it just nostalgia reasons. But now I have it on Blu-ray. I can't wait to look at it. There's a lot of special features. But you know, it was, again, from 1980, May and June 1980, Allied Artists Home Entertainment put it out. And I remember it was also Brooke Shields' first film. She was 5 years old. She's murdered in the movie. What that has to do with anything, I don't know. But, you know, I think now, if you're not engaged and you don't love a movie, and I have to say, I'm guilty of this too. There's so many entertainment choices that now I think if we're not captivated, it's not just kids with short attention spans, it's all of us. Let's be real, people. It's all of us. If you're not getting something out of whatever you're watching in 5 minutes or 10 minutes, you either turn off your browser, you go click on another show, you find something that'll turn your crank immediately. I get it. But when I was growing up, that wasn't the case. But I think there's a lot of material, certainly all of the canon of great science fiction novels. Dune was published before I was born. You know, I went and found it, I think, I want to say 6th grade, probably 12 when I first read Dune. Blew me away. Stranger in a Strange Land, Robert Heinlein, the story of Valentine Michael Smith. I was encountering the idea of free love, you know, all of this stuff. All of these things came about before I was born. And I think that if you're open to it, as well you should be, there's a lot to love. Most of the things that are deemed classics are worth delving into. And they are old, but they're going to be new to you. And even though someone said, well, these are classics, I was never like, oh, really? You know, show me. I never felt that way. I was always like, all right, well, if this is on the 100 great AFI films list, I got to check this out. And I would. And what I would suggest is that if you've heard something's great, you've heard something's classic, it's worth checking out, you should. And go into it with an open mind. Not everything is going to be exactly the way you want it right away, but if you're one of these people that wants immediate gratification, 2 hours aside, you got to get yourself in this headspace that, okay, this might not be the thing that I'm going to love immediately, but I'm going to sit down and I'm going to try and be open-minded and watch it. And just like Joel was saying, he came to the original series. There's a lot of people that try and watch the original series now because of the color, because of the set design, or the limitations of production in the 1960s. They tune out. Now, I was lucky when I was a kid. We didn't have the great extremes. It wasn't like we lived in a world where I lived in a pre-Star Wars world until Star Wars came out. So Star Wars was the outlier. Now everything, modern films from since Star Wars, for the last 40 years, we've just have an amazing array of beautiful production design and amazing special effects. So it's really difficult for people, especially younger people, to go back and be asked to sit down and watch things that even the way they were made is very different than the way things are made now. The pacing is very, very different. And you have to teach yourself how to sit down, watch these things. I get it. But I would say this, that the rewards are, they outweigh, well, look, it's all rewarding. There is no downside to going back and watching classic stuff. It's all worth seeing, I think. What do you guys think? I could be wrong. Anyway, JB Bonifacio says he just finished House of X 2. It's the issue of the year. For those of you who don't know, Jonathan Hickman is tasked to reinvent the X-Men franchise, and he's doing House of X, and he's doing the other one of X, 2 X books that he's doing concurrently. I think he's doing 6 issues of both, where he's reinventing the X franchise. He's completely gone crazy. I know what's going on in the books. I have not read House of X 2 yet, but amazing stuff he's doing, and he's really doing exactly what the X-Men needed, completely shaking up the status quo. Everything old is new again, and boy, from what I've read, he's gone off the deep end, but in the very best way. JB, I'm going to have to catch up with House of X 2, but all I can say is Krakoa. I know everything is not what we think might be going on with those first 2 issues is probably not what's really going on. I can only imagine House of X 2 was mind-blowing. Can't wait. Tron Michelson is here. Tron, I don't recognize you, Tron. This might be your first time coming in, super chatting. Thank you very much, first of all, for supporting the channel. Tron Michelson says, hi, Rob. I love and collect old Wonderful World of Disney episodes. Do you think Disney Plus will have episodes or full seasons of this series? Tron, I hope so. I think one of the great things about Disney Plus is that they're going to go back and put all of this material on their channel. I would hope that every episode of Wonderful World of Disney is on the streaming service. I'm sure eventually it will be, and I think that's what they want, is you won't have to collect them anymore. I know. I'm a big physical media collector myself, hence the Alice disc, which I really can't explain. But hey, I'm glad I have it. By the way, kudos to Arrow for the O-ring. As we've talked about, the O-ring is an O-ring. Kudos to this. I love O-rings with this matte finish. Ooh, go Arrow. I love Arrow. But yes, so I would hope that they put that out. I think that would be great. Koba is here. Koba says, finally watching the Fast and Furious movies on Too Fast, Too Furious, and was wondering what next, Tokyo Swift or Fast and Furious 2009? You'll enjoy it. I really like Tokyo Drift a lot, but I'm saying, Koba, watch Tokyo Drift. I love it a lot more than many others do. Willow Yang is here. Hello, Willow. Willow Yang says, were you surprised by what happened to Yar when you first watched Skin of Evil? I really did not see it coming. Yes. For those of you, you know what, Willow, I'm going to spoil this. Tasha Yar was murdered. She was murdered in what was the 17th episode of The Next Generation, Skin of Evil, by the evil creature Armis. What a dick. But yes, she died. And I was, in fact, shocked. But, Willow, if you're really delving in, you're going to go all the way through Next Generation. Let me just say, you've not seen the last of Tasha Yar. Anyway, you will get to the third season, and one of the great episodes of Star Trek, not just The Next Generation, but of Star Trek ever, is the third season Next Generation episode, Yesterday's Enterprise. We all know what we're talking about, but Willow does not. I look forward to appreciate Robert Wise's range. Hey, man, Robert Wise edited Citizen Kane. He directed Curse of the Cat People. He directed Hell Rooftops after he made Star Trek The Next Generation. Or Star Trek the motion picture. See, I've got Star Trek on the brain. Anyway, I know. Well, my favorite Robert Wise movie might just be West Side Story, probably. But I'm a big fan. I understand Robert Wise. He was a very, very talented man. Very talented man. Anyway, got more letters. Got a lot of good letters. This next one, we were talking about this on the John Campea show yesterday, and this one comes from Justin MC or Justin MC. Justin says, Rob, I'm listening to you right now on John Campea's podcast, and I felt I should type up a little something. You, Aaron, and John are discussing action stars and what happened to them. People have a habit of blaming political correctness or social justice warriors or whatever other boogeyman or straw man they can conjure up on any change they don't like. The reason why action movies aren't the way they used to be in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s isn't because of political correctness. It's because this is the year 2019. Action movies definitely are a product of their time. Movies made in the 1970s and 80s were very much film versions of the red meat paperback novels, very popular with middle-aged white men at the time. They were about grizzled Vietnam vets who the government called to do the dirty work when the lily-livered liberals in Washington didn't want to get their hands dirty. They were also about men who had it up to here with crime in their neighborhoods and becoming a vigilante. The protagonists are always white men. The bad guys are always black, brown, or commies. And the movies reflected this. Death Wish, Remo Williams, and First Blood were written in the 70s. John Rambo, an action hero you mentioned on the show, is a vet with undiagnosed PTSD who comes home and kills cops. This is an action hero who even the anti-social justice warrior and anti-PC crowds would hate if that were to come out today. The villains have changed in these movies too as the years passed. Anyone who complains about movies being political has never seen an American action movie in the 80s or 90s or the 70s. It was the commies, then the crime-riddled inner city, and the race coding that came along with it. Then terrorists became the big bad guys, or South Africans in the case of Lethal Weapon 2. Since 9/11, the terrorists have always been Muslim. That's because that is the kind of bad guy that would scare the audience into cheering for our heroes. They weren't always the bad guy. Didn't Rambo team up with the Mujahideen to fight the Soviets in one of those movies? That would be Rambo 3, and you'd be correct. The bad guy reflects who's the enemy of the audience at the time. The hero changed too. Dirty Harry was eventually replaced with everyman cop John McClane. A bare-chested, gun-toting Rambo replaced decades later with Jack Ryan, a wonky CIA spook. Or Ethan Hunt, a slightly more hardcore version of Jack Ryan. I feel like I may have strayed from the point, so I will restate it and finish. In the discussion of the great American action stars and action movies, you can't blame political correctness or social justice warriors for what you may believe to be the decline of the genre. Times change, audiences change, the culture changes. Classics like RoboCop, Death Wish, and Total Recall have been remade in the 21st century, and they all sucked. They sucked because these films were made for the political climate and audience fears of the time, not because of some false notion that a bunch of millennials or social justice warriors would get upset over it. You can't say that these kinds of movies can't be made today. There were 3 Expendables movies made in the 21st century specifically for that audience that longs for the return of the kinds of movies that the stars of these movies are known for making in their youth. Action movies today are going strong and are much more violent than the Arnold, Sylvester, or Dolph flicks back in the day. If anything, maybe people are bemoaning the death of the American action film genre because so much great stuff is being made overseas. The Raid, The Night Comes for Us, Buy, Bust, and other Southeast Asian action flicks that are influenced by the great Hong Kong of the 90s and action movies have come and blown us all away. At the same time, our best American action movies today are Mission Impossible and The Fast and the Furious. The genre is doing just fine in 2019. Justin Mick. It's not MC, it's Mick. Justin, a great letter. A lot of very cogent insight there that I don't necessarily disagree with. But here's the thing. I think that one of the things about, like, I'm always going on, I am the gatekeeper, after all, of verisimilitude. And when you watch, for instance, the movies of the 70s, the gritty, and they were gritty. New York was a crime-ridden cesspool. So there were a lot of movies that I loved, whether it was Death Wish, whether it was James Glickenhaus's The Exterminator. There were the rape revenge films of the 70s, women who were horribly raped and they would come back and exact their revenge. Or if family members were raped, Charles Bronson would come and take revenge. We don't see, I'm not saying that there are no rapes in films, but rapes were portrayed much more graphically, I think. There's a few exceptions, but the kind of, the reality of our action stars was, they were far more grounded because it was very much set in the real world. And you're right. I completely agree with you that we were, during the Vietnam era, we were watching, our 6 o'clock news was showing dead Americans in body bags, dead Vietnamese, not in body bags, laying in the streets. The idea of violence, of real violence, was permeating even the most pious of all American families. You turn on the TV and the idea of crime and violence was very, very real. I think you're right. The action genre hasn't gone away. Action movies haven't gone away. But the action genre now is much more heightened and moved away from the reality of life. Even the Raid, or as I like to call it, the Rad, and the Rad 2, even radder. I love the Raid, and I love the Raid 2 Barandal. Great examples of action cinema. Those are very gritty, but they still have an over-the-top feel to them. Whereas there's some really extreme, difficult-to-watch violence. They Call Her One Eye, which was the movie that Quentin Tarantino based Daryl Hannah's character on in Kill Bill. The original version of the film, and it's released on video as Thriller, A Cruel Picture. This was a Swedish film that was it's a really difficult film to watch in its original version. I mean, it's a rape revenge film where a woman is hooked on heroin. She is raped and she comes back and turns the tables on her tormentors. And it's literally hardcore sex, hardcore violence. And I don't think audiences today would be able to take that kind of thing. Too real. And then we got into sort of the cartoonish nature of these larger than life figures. I mean, and I agree with you. It's I guess when I was talking about it on the Campy show, I had mentioned we live in a different world now where our action heroes, and indeed all of our characters, movies now are spectacles. And we're going to the theater. There isn't the gritty realism of the films of the 70s, whether it's Dirty Harry Callahan, whether it was Charles Bronson in the Death Wish films, whether it was Robert Ginty as the Exterminator in 1980, or whether it was a lot of the blaxploitation films, whether it was Slaughter, whether it was Shaft. I mean, these were all characters of the streets, and they were dealing with flamboyant villains, but it was very grounded. The action was very grounded. It was not as over the top. Now we are in a sci-fi heightened environment where action films, action cinema, and even our heroes are barely tethered to reality. So it is different, and I think the unreality of the action makes it more palatable. It's much more along the lines of it's more of a roller coaster ride. I don't think audiences of today would be watching, like, look at the difference between the original Death Wish and Eli Roth's remake with Bruce Willis. There's a lot of differences there. I mean, what's interesting is when I think about an action movie, this might be a little strange, but The Equalizer 2 is a movie that was more along the lines of what you used to see in the 70s and early 80s. I don't know. It's interesting. I think you're bang on, though. I really like this letter a lot. I think you're absolutely correct in what you have to say. I think very cogent reasoning, sir. And I salute you, Mr. Mick, because I do think you were definitely on to something. But look, when I say social justice warriors or the way we perceive things, it still is about the time we live in and how things change. And look, styles are different. Every generation is different. Everybody's seeing different things all the time. And I think it's great. I think it's great. But great letter. Really appreciated what you had to say about the I think it's great. This next letter is near and dear to my heart. This next letter comes from Chris Wrigglesworth, who's written before, longtime member of the Post-Geek Singularity. Dear Rob, long days and pleasant nights. I had to leave a comment on that extremely awesome, fantastic planet shirt you were wearing the other day. For those of you who don't know, the blue alien holding the Tyr, the little human being, in her hand, Tiva. That was from the movie Fantastic Planet, one of my favorite science fiction films ever made. It is a Franco-Czech co-production. René Laloux, based on the book by Roland Topor, I think, from 1973. It's on beautiful Criterion Blu-ray. It's probably on the Criterion channel. But Fantastic Planet, one of my favorite science fiction films of all time. Had to leave a comment on that extremely awesome Fantastic Planet shirt you were wearing the other day. I first saw Fantastic Planet in the 1980s on a late-night movie program. I think USA Up All Night, and it haunted me for years. Thank God for Amazon, where I was finally able to buy a copy on DVD. It's a wonderful story of how a technologically more advanced race could view humans. I've read about some of the other interpretations and allegories which may be there, but the story doesn't hit you over the head with the agendas. This is important as it allows one to freely enjoy it and take from it what they will. I also agreed with some who found the animation, while less technical, a welcome departure from the likes of Disney, Hanna-Barbera, etc. While many of us geeks probably know Fantastic Planet well, it is probably somewhat underrated or at least criminally underseen. Would you share your thoughts and perhaps bring it to the attention of some others in the Post-Geek Singularity that may not have heard of it but could potentially enjoy it as well? Thanks so much, Chris Wrigglesworth. Well, Chris, first of all, thanks for your letter. I love Fantastic Planet. I first encountered Fantastic Planet. I've told this story before, but I'll tell it again. In 1976, when I was 9 years old, my mother took me to see Logan's Run on the Friday night it opened at the John Dan's Theater. Took me and my sister. I was 9. My sister was 7. And it was a double bill. We went to opening night, huge theater, SRO's John Dan Cinema. Gigantic. It's where I saw Superman the movie and Star Trek the Motion Picture. Just a great theater. I even saw The Legend of the Lone Ranger with Quentin Spilsbury there. I don't know why, I just thought of that, but I did. So we saw Logan's Run. It was a double feature, and the second movie playing was Fantastic Planet, or La Planète Sauvage, if you watch it in the original French. It won a Grand Prix award at the Cannes Film Festival in 73. And the plot of the movie is basically, it takes place on an alien planet, and the Drogs, who are giant bipedal humanoid aliens that are like 20 feet tall. They're huge. They're the dominant species on this planet, and the film is very surreal. And it's made with what's called limited animation or photo cutout animation, where they literally had paper dolls. I mean, they were two-dimensional, but they would animate. So the animation is not It's very different from Disney animation, or as you said, Hanna-Barbera animation. So a lot of people are initially put off by that because it's paper things being stop motion moved over paper backgrounds and things like that. I really liked that when I first saw it, but basically, some point in the past, human beings had landed on this planet, and human beings are now a la Planet of the Apes. They are hunted and they are enslaved and they are turned into pets by these aliens. And humans, like in Planet of the Apes, they've basically been sort of dumbed down. And the story is basically about a human who is, after the human's mother is killed in the beginning of the movie, is adopted as a pet by Tiva, the daughter of this couple, this alien couple, this adult couple in the film. And Ter, he is able to listen in via a machine, a learning machine that fits over the head of the one of the drogs. The humans are the ohms, the aliens are called the drogs. And Ter uses this device and learns from this device and becomes very smart, and ends up escaping and going into the human underground and beginning an uprising, a rebellion of the human characters. And it goes from there. And there's a lot going on in the film. It's a very strange movie. Now, I'll tell you something interesting. Barry Bostwick, who played Ace in Megaforce, who's also in the Rocky Horror Picture Show, narrates and does the voice of Ter, the human main character, in the American dub of Fantastic Planet. Now, the original version's not in English, but I'd only ever seen it in English. Oh, I also didn't say that. So my mom allowed us, after Logan's Run was over, to watch Fantastic Planet. And in the opening scene, Ter's mom is killed. And it's pretty harrowing. And my mom was so upset, she jumped up and she grabbed me and my sister and she said, "I will not sit here and watch a movie where human beings are being treated like ants." And my mom literally dragged us out of the theater. It's very embarrassing. My mom embarrassed me a lot when I was a kid. Nancy Burnett at her finest. So I got to see the first 10 minutes of this movie, or probably the first 5 minutes, and it became this mythical film. And it wasn't until years later where I was able to go to a revival house, the Harvard Exit Theater in Seattle, and see Fantastic Planet on a double bill with Ralph Bakshi's Wizards, that I finally got to see it. I want to say it's 78 or 79. So it was a number of years later, and I finally saw Fantastic Planet. It quickly became a favorite film of mine. So check it out. Everybody should watch it. It's a great science fiction film, and the Criterion Blu-ray is terrific. So thanks for writing in, Chris. I appreciate anytime you can talk about Forbidden Planet, Fantastic Planet. It's a good time. So I really like that. It's great. And now here's another. Let's see if anybody has anything else in the chat room. What are you guys saying? Is anybody saying anything? I don't know. Nope, we're good there. Here's another letter that comes from Liam Kerrigan, who's written in before. Good to hear from Liam again. "Hi, Rob. On a recent episode of Robservations, you've been very vocal about your love of Star Trek, the motion picture." Wow, little old me. I'll be honest. When it comes to the Trek movies, I prefer Star Trek First Contact and Star Trek The Wrath of Khan. But one area where I think Star Trek the Motion Picture surpasses both of these later films is in its music. Absolutely agreed. The theme that plays when the revamped Enterprise comes into view for the first time was so iconic that it later became the theme for Star Trek The Next Generation. Well, the theme music was, yeah. And to many 80s kids like me, the first piece of music we think of when someone says Star Trek. Indeed, there are so many theme tunes from the 70s and 80s that remain iconic even today. Superman, Star Wars, Batman, Rocky. They're probably the most popular, but there are a great many more. Jaws. Hum the first few bars of these themes and everyone will know the movie you are thinking of. The same can't be said of today's movies. Unfortunately not. I usually go to the movies at least once a month, and in all honesty, with the notable exception of the Avengers films, probably the last truly memorable movie theme I heard was Man of Steel, way back in 2013. It seems to me that these days, the likes of Marvel, Disney, and WB just don't place the same importance on having big, bombastic, memorable theme tunes in their movies anymore. This saddens me. As I type this, I have the soundtrack to Superman the movie playing in the background. Even now, some 40 years later, it remains an absolute joy to listen to. I hope you're listening to the newly remastered version that La La Land Records put out. It is spectacular. I highly doubt there are any movie themes from the past decade or so that ultimately will have Superman's longevity. But why is this? Why do you think Hollywood has largely abandoned the concept of characters and movie series having their own iconic theme tunes? It is a question of lack of creativity, or do filmmakers just not consider it a high priority anymore? Do you think memorable theme tunes will ever make a comeback? Would love to hear your thoughts. Thanks, and keep up the good work, Liam C. Well, Liam Corrigan, I have to say, very good point, fantastic point. I grew up, my love of music began because of movie soundtracks. And really, I loved the music. The music that I used to know first was, of course, from the original series. Because as a kid, when I would play with my Mego action figures, or even before then, when I would play with my model spaceships, you know, you couldn't play Star Trek and not hum as a kid the theme music, not just the Star Trek theme music, but the music throughout the series. Everyone knows dun 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 dun. You know, when from Amok Time, the first season, the second season opener, or the Doomsday Machine music, dun 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 dun. You know, whatever. Those are bad renditions, but you all get it. Star Trek had amazing, iconic theme music that, by the way, Rick Berman said, we do not want that in Star Trek The Next Generation. Even though Ron Jones, for the first 4 seasons of the show, was trying to slip in that kind of iconic music. But so Star Trek theme music was the first music I recognized. And then, of course, there was Barry Gray's theme music from UFO. And then, of course, Space 1999. And then when I started going to the movies, Jaws, pre-Star Wars, everyone knew. No. Everyone knows that, you know. And of course, Star Wars changed everything. Star Wars was the first album that I bought in terms of theme music. It led me to start listening to my mom's Beethoven records. And I think you're absolutely right. The golden age, Jerry Goldsmith, who did the score for Star Trek The Motion Picture, and John Williams, even before people like James Horner came on the scene. Clearly somebody's here. I've got both Gilbert and Tallulah barking. It's amazing. Hey, you two. Come here. You guys want cookies? Come get some cookies. Come here. Look at this. I mean, I am like the Pied Piper of Hamelin when it comes to this. Come here. You want one? Come up. Come up, Gilbert. Yep. That's what I'm talking about. You know, buddy. You're well trained, and you can have one. Right, dude? See, this is my magical Gilbert and Tallulah. Such a good boy, buddy. You're buddy. Having a buddy. Yeah. Good boy, huh? Okay, look. Sorry, I'm in the middle of making my point about film music. What's right, buddy? Good boy. Okay, now you got to get down. Okay? Good boy. Love these dogs. They're the best. Anyway, so back to the film music. So I was talking about film music of the 70s. So it wasn't just Star Wars. I remember getting the Jaws 2 soundtrack and loving the music. That piece, the first piece, the Orca. They find the Orca with the harp at the beginning. And then, of course, Capricorn 1, one of the great themes. And I started buying theme music, and I think here's what's happened. The old school composers. Oh, you know, you talk about, now that I'm thinking about it, if you talk about James Horner. Now, I like James Horner, but Star Trek 2, as much as I like his score for Star Trek 2, when I first saw Star Trek 2, I'm like, that is the score for Humanoids from the Deep. By the way, if you haven't seen Humanoids from the Deep, I strongly suggest you watch Humanoids from the Deep. Humanoids from the Deep is great. But it's got a James Horner score that's clearly what became Star Trek 2. And his score for Battle Beyond the Stars is totally Goldsmith's score for Star Trek The Motion Picture. But these were guys that wrote music. I mean, they literally wrote on paper. And I think that Lalo Schifrin, another great composer of the 70s, and these are all people I was buying the music for, that this kind of music, what was not happening was because you didn't have digital technology, didn't exist. What's happening now is things are being temp tracked, and you have musicians who are literally creating music as they play it. Music has become more atmospheric as opposed to being thematic. And I think that the atmospheric music as opposed to thematic music has become par for the course. And it's unfortunate because, like, you would hear Jerry Goldsmith's score for Logan's Run, or a James Bond score, John Barry's James Bond music, the theme music, the James Bond opening, whether it was, I mean, even his later scores for Octopussy, when you had All Time High or View to a Kill, the theme songs would then be repeated. Those motifs or variations of those themes would be repeated within the symphonic score, and that was far more important. In movies now, I think that because people aren't sitting down with pen and paper and coming up with themes in their minds, they're creating these themes as they're playing them, and it's a different world. Again, it's a different world, different disciplines. I don't know if people write music the way they used to write music, and they sort of come up with it on the fly. I can't speak to that. I should have Lucas Kendall come talk more about it. But you're absolutely right. I think movie music is much more like wallpaper, and because it's easy to temp track movies with other movies' scores, that people are told to emulate a temp track as opposed to write something new. Because when you're editing a movie, like when I'm editing a film, like when I was editing Tango Shalom, I'm temp tracking the movie with other people's music. So it's hard when you have a movie that you're like, here's the movie, you send it to a composer to watch, there's a temp score there, and you wind up with, you might be in love with your temp, and you want the composer to emulate that, but also make it their own. There's a lot of different reasons, but I do think that it's a good point, and I just don't buy very many movie soundtracks anymore. Our boy Swack Props, who lives in Malaysia, and he made the prop of the Ninth Gate, the Nine Gates, the book, which he sent me a copy of, which I haven't received yet. I can't wait. He sent, I don't do this channel to get gifts from people or anything like that, but he sent me a copy of his prop replica of one of the Nine Gates, and I think that the book, The Nine Gates, which is the coolest thing ever. But the reason I bring that up is the Ninth Gate by Wojtek Kilar. The score is one of the great modern horror scores. He also scored Coppola's Dracula. Great score, and like Christopher Young, who scored the first Hellraiser, another great score. But I haven't bought film music. I bought it basically from 77 up to, I still get a couple of scores. One of my favorite scores that I've heard in a long time is Rachel Portman's score from Never Let Me Go. What a fantastic score that is. There's still a lot of great music being written for the movies. I just don't think it's as iconic because it's not as memorable for whatever reason. We could get into that, but I don't know. I'm kind of losing my point here. But anyway, I agree with you. I agree with you. Yeah. So this one comes from, actually, before I read this, let me see if you guys are saying anything in the old chat room there. If you guys have, yes, of course. Taki75 said, thoughts on Louis Buñuel. I'm a big fan of Louis Buñuel. Louis Buñuel, all the way from Un Chien Andalou to Belle de Jour. I'm a huge fan. Buñuel, it was basically considered a surrealist. He had a long career in films. I actually have above my bed one of my favorite movies, Belle de Jour, of all time. Catherine Deneuve basically stars as a bored housewife with no libido who decides to become a prostitute during the day. It's an incredible film, and I'm a huge fan. So Buñuel had an amazing career, and his films are incredible. Belle de Jour being my favorite. But yes, I'm a huge fan. You can't not love movies and not love Louis Buñuel. And also, of course, everybody, Un Chien Andalou. If you haven't seen Un Chien Andalou, Un Chien Andalou is a short film. It's the short film where you see the eyeball being slit open. Everybody has to watch that. It's one of the first films you really start watching in film school, and I've probably seen it a million times. But this is an interesting one. Stub McShave asks, thoughts on the Ralph Bakshi Lord of the Rings cartoon? I would say animated film, Stubble. But for those of you who don't know, I want to say it's 1978. Let's see. LOTR animated. What year did it come out? It was 78. Okay. So for those of you who might not know, Ralph Bakshi, who made Fritz the Cat and the 9 Lives of Fritz the Cat, and also made Wizards that I saw on a double bill with Fantastic Planet, he did a feature-length adaptation of Lord of the Rings, and it was basically Fellowship and halfway through Two Towers. And it's an animated film, but it relied heavily on what's called rotoscoping, where they would film human beings and then draw over them. So it's just a style. I mean, a lot of Snow White was rotoscope, but it was very stylized, just the way Wizards was as well. They used multimedia. It wasn't just your standard cell animated film. I liked the Lord of the Rings animated movie. It was never finished. They did a TV version. I think, was it Rankin and Bass? I don't know who did Return of the King, but they did The Hobbit for TV, and then they did Ralph Bakshi did Lord of the Rings. I liked the Lord of the Rings feature film, and Leonard Rosenman, who scored Star Trek: The Voyage Home, whose score I wasn't a big fan of. I loved the score for Lord of the Rings. I thought it was great. It's not perfect, but it's definitely worth seeing, and it's really interesting to see that film. I haven't seen it, God, years and years. I mean, I don't even know if I watched it when I was working on the Lord of the Rings discs on the documentaries. I would, you know what? You make me want to see it again now that I'm thinking about it. But I liked it. I mean, I saw it in the theater when it opened. I saw it opening weekend. It was a big deal. You know, when I was in elementary school, everyone was reading Lord of the Rings and then Sword of Shannara. I remember there was a kid named Brian Bergout, and Brian Bergout and I were having a race to see who could finish Sword of Shannara first. And by the way, I heard from Terry Brooks. I interviewed Terry Brooks myself at his house in Seattle, and he said it's pronounced Shannara. I called it the Sword of Shannara. I was always saying Shannara. It's Shannara. That's from Terry Brooks himself, just to be clear. This one comes in from Jason Manweiler, who says, "Greetings, Rob. Hope you were doing well. I've sent you a few letters since you read my last one, but I think between Comic-Con and stuff, they've fallen through the cracks. Hopefully you've seen them. If not, I'm sure you'll get a lot of letters, so it's okay. I'm writing to you about a topic that was on the John Campea show yesterday. The topic at hand was the 5 things the MCU needs to do in order to succeed going forward. I do not watch John on a regular basis, but YouTube suggested the video and the topic got my eye. This video fully articulates why I do not listen or watch John on a regular basis. He doesn't seem to have a full understanding of things sometimes. His point that the MCU should do separate solo-style movies not connected to the larger universe is counterintuitive to what the MCU fundamentally is. The MCU is designed to be a connected larger universe by telling smaller chapters of the grand story. For my sensibilities, John goes way off the rails with his ideas sometimes, but I found your 5 points to be spot on." Of course you did. No, I'm kidding. This is why I'm here at the Post-Geek Singularity. I find your insight and perspective enlightening, and I appreciate the logical position you take. Why, thank you, Jason. Some people didn't. At least they didn't yesterday, but I very much appreciate you saying so. So thank you. I appreciate that. To continue the success the MCU has had, it needs to do exactly what they're doing in Phase 4. Introduce new characters while continuing the story with familiar characters we already know. Thanks for all you do, Rob. Also, spoiler alert, my next letter to you is about Gundam, so I hope you enjoy it. Have a good one, Rob. Jason M. Well, for those of you who might not know what Jason M is talking about, as many of you might know, some of you might not, I do a show 3 times a week now with John Campea in the mornings from 9 o'clock to 10:30. I'm on the John Campea Show on the John Campea Network on YouTube, his show, and it's called the John Campea Show. And yesterday, Aaron Cummings, John, and myself each had 5 things that we would do, what we think what they should be doing to make the MCU go forward. And I had said that one of those things is you have to introduce new fresh characters, the Eternals and Shang-Chi. And, you know, you've got your marquee characters, Captain America and, well, spoiler alert, Captain America, Black Widow, and, you know, Tony Stark, for various reasons, might not be moving forward in the MCU if you're living under a rock. But they have to introduce new characters, and they have to do what they did 10 years ago, which is introduce these new characters and build them up. Now, whether they're going to be marquee characters the way Iron Man, Thor, and Captain America and Black Widow and Hulk have been remains to be seen. But then they have to take familiar characters such as Doctor Strange and do more with them. I mean, Doctor Strange has become very important. I love the way he was used in Infinity War and how he became a cornerstone of the MCU. And I love the fact that they're taking the character in a different direction with Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness and teaming up Doctor Strange with Scarlet Witch, which is going to take Scarlet Witch, who's been a second fiddle player, probably thrust her up into the forefront. And of course, that's coming in on the heels of her new show, WandaVision, where we're going to see the Vision and Wanda Maximoff or Scarlet Witch together. And as everyone knows, the Vision and Scarlet Witch as individual characters and as a couple were a cornerstone of the Marvel Marvel comic universe for a long time, especially with the Avengers. And there's a lot of history there, both with the Avengers and the X-Men. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. And I also think that one of the things I thought they should continue to do is they need to tell allegorical stories. I think fantasy films, whether it's science fiction, fantasy, or horror, as long as they're also telling stories which in an allegorical way sort of reflect back to our culture of the time, it becomes interesting. I mean, you could say that Captain America Winter Soldier was a 70s conspiracy thriller, and you'd be right. That was definitely the genre they were going for. But the idea of surveilling the whole population, just like they talked about in that film, has become a hot button topic today, and that's what gives those movies added resonance. Those are some of the things I said. But Jason, I agree with you. I think you're right. And I think what the MCU has been doing, it's called the Marvel Cinematic Universe, is their cohesive universe is part of why it has succeeded and why it's been so much fun to watch. No one's ever done it before. There are detractors that are like, well, it's like watching episodic television. But not really. Not really. S. Beam is here. S. Beam said, would it be possible to, I guess you say, would it be possible to light your 6 scale figures collection or show, I'll show you mine if you show me yours. Well, as you can see, I mean, it's not lit up and the backing is on here, but you can kind of see that this is a lot. This is not all of my 6 scale figures. These are Hot Toys. You know what? I just have time because I was taking it. These cases, for people that you can't see, but I'll point. So these cases, I bought these cases back in the mid-aughts. They were sort of specially designed cases I bought in like 2004, and they were in my office. I had 4 of them. One of them got broken in a move, but I still have 3. And I do have, these are some of my Avengers Hot Toys figures. Like you can see sort of marquee characters around here. Like that's Iron Spider, and that's Hulk, and it's hard to see. That's the Vision back there, and Scarlet Witch is back there, and Ultron and Thanos is here. But I mean, I do have quite an extensive Hot Toys collection. I just don't have a great place to display them, even in my Imaginarium, which I'm hopefully gonna do. But these actual lights work with fuses, and I got new fuses for them, so I need to light them up. By the way, one of my favorites is this is the Hot Toy figure of Marlon Brando as Jor-El, but it was done for Superman Returns, but never released in the United States. So that's a cool figure. There's the Christopher Reeve Superman, which you can't see. the Wakandan throne. Black Panther's there. Bane is right there. But one day I will have all my. I don't just have a lot of Hot Toys figures. I have a lot of 6th scale figures in general. I love 6th scale figures. I've got 6th scale figures from the Twilight Zone and James Bond and Doctor Who and Blade Runner. I got all kinds. But yes, I need to make another video. There is a video on the Robservations channel, the Burnettwork, that I made for the 100th episode of Collider Heroes that you can see a lot of my collection. Yeah, go watch that. It is on the Burnettwork. You can check it out. Don Stellato is here. Rob, what was your opinion on Saw 9 not having Tobin Bell in it? It felt mixed. I felt mixed because it won't feel like a Saw movie without him. Well, you're right. Tobin Bell being Jigsaw, his character has been long gone in the Saw franchise. But look, I agree with you. I think Tobin Bell became the cornerstone of the Saw franchise. But by the way, I worked on the first Saw. I shot some interviews. I was on the set of James Wan's Saw at Lacey Street Studios. God, that was a long time ago. I shot some behind the scenes for that they used for the EPK and the DVD special features. But Tobin Bell became important in the Saw franchise kind of later. I mean, I know he was always a part of it, but in the first Saw, I mean, he's a presence, of course, but I think you could make a good Saw movie without him. It's gotten a little silly, but you're right. I mean, he's become, it's like a Friday. You can't make a Friday the 13th movie without Jason, unless you want to bring back Mrs. Voorhees, I guess, but she's long dead. But you're right. I miss Tobin Bell. First of all, Tobin Bell has such a unique look to him that he's so iconic in terms of his look. How do you make a Saw movie without him? I don't know. So, yes. Now here comes a letter. I like this letter a lot, actually. This is a good one. This comes from Pete, and Pete writes a great letter. This is a really long letter from the UK, but I like this, so I'm going to read it. Comes from Pete. Hi, Rob. I just thought I'd add to the letters section on the ever-growing Post-Geek Singularity. By the way, if you like these letters, they're all on the website. Please, you can go and post underneath them. I would encourage that anyone goes to the Burnettwork.net. You can find these letters and comment. You don't just have to comment on the YouTube page. Please go to the Burnettwork.net. You can also support me there, support the channel there, support everything we're doing, and the website's getting bigger and bigger all the time. Anyway, I just thought I'd add to the letters section on the ever-growing Post-Geek Singularity revolution that is so hot right now, like Hansel. To paraphrase Ed Norton in Fight Club, it was all on the tip of everyone's tongue. The notorious RMB just gave it a name. Man, I love the fact that I'm Tyler Durden. Anyway, like many of your viewers probably did, recognize your name from the late 90s Free Enterprise, Sci-Fi Universe, and Cinescape days, that Sandra Bullock, the net time, just before the internet went mainstream. Yes, it's true, and if Free Enterprise had waited just another couple of years, I might have had a career as a director. So when I saw you a while back on Twitter, I thought, oh my God, it's Robert Meyer Burnett, and clicked the follow. First of all, let me give some viewers some context. So in the mid-90s, I was working at Full Moon Entertainment on movies like Arcade. I was actually in The Lurking Fear. I played a monster. But I was working in low-budget independent cinema, and I was also working with a group of people like Chris Gore and Mark Altman at their magazine, Sci-Fi Universe. They started a magazine, and it was called the Magazine for Sci-Fi Fans with a Life. And we fancied ourselves, we were the cool geeks. We were geeks that went out with girls on the weekends and, lived it up. But we wrote the magazine from that perspective. It was kind of a snarky, the way Spy was. We were kind of the sci-fi version of Spy. At least that's what we thought of ourselves as. We were still just big geeks. Who were we kidding? But there was a contingent of people, and it was a heady time where there were a lot of people that had come to Los Angeles that have gone on. People like Jeff Bond, who's written a number of books and writes on film music, and he recently wrote a book on the Kelvin universe, the art of the Kelvin universe for Star Trek. He wrote a book on Planet of the Apes. He has an insane book published by Creature Features on the work of Irwin Allen, this gigantic coffee table book I can't recommend highly enough. He's still writing for the various, I think the fourth incarnation of Geek Magazine. But back in the 90s, there was a group of us that all came to LA, and we all kind of knew each other, and we were all Dan Weber, who now has been working on Futurama and The Simpsons forever, and a lot of people who have had a lot of success in both motion pictures and television, but we were all bonded by our love of science fiction, fantasy, and horror, and a lot of us wrote for Sci-Fi Universe magazine that was co-founded by Chris Gore and Mark Altman. So, and of course, Anthony Ferrante was over at Cinescape, who later went on to direct all the Sharknado movies. So it was a heady time, my friends, a heady time. It was very inspirational and it was a lot of fun. And Lisa Reen was producing a show called SF Vortex that I was on a lot. Also on the Burnettwork, you can see when I was on talking about David Cronenberg's Crash. Roger Lodge from Blind Date was the host of this show, and they would have this thing called the War Room, and I would appear on it periodically. I was on with Stan Lee once, but it was a heady time. So that's what Pete is talking about. Anyway, I, like many of your viewers probably did, recognize your name from the late 90s Free Enterprise Sci-Fi Universe and Cinescape days. That's Sandra Bullock, the net time just before the internet went mainstream. So when I saw you a while back on Twitter, I thought, oh my God, it's R&B, and clicked the follow. Then I saw your YouTube show, Robservations, and even though I obviously didn't know you other than from the late 90s era, I knew within a couple of seconds watching that we parked our shuttlecrafts in the same bay. Like a few letters you read out here, I too had a tough time in my early years for my love of sci-fi. But most of all, Star Trek. I became a fan due to seeing the original cast movies. As a kid growing up in the 80s, I was taken to see most of the PG-rated sci-fi fantasy stuff like Return of the Jedi, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, E.T., Back to the Future, Bond, etc. But it was the Trek movies that I loved the most, along with the Superman movies. I even attended a Trek 1 through 6 all-day screening in 87, seeing the epic, the motion picture. It had to be 91. Oh, no. Pardon me. I even attended a Star Trek 1 through 4 all-day screening in 87, and seeing the epic, the motion picture on the big screen at last, which I'd been too young to see in 79. At my school, I found out, to my cost, just how uncool it was to like Star Trek in the UK in the late 80s and 90s. I was labeled a freak and weird, like a member of a cult, Scientology or something. But with The Voyage Home being the biggest Trek movie so far, it was pretty much an 80s blockbuster like Top Gun, Crocodile Dundee, or Back to the Future, and Next Generation about to start, Trek was bigger than ever in the US. I couldn't get enough, and that led to me talking about it with other kids who were astounded that I could be into Trek over the ultra-cool Star Wars, which I wasn't that into. Looking back, I probably shouldn't have talked openly about my obsession. But at the time, I just didn't get why they were so opposed to Trek. I was primarily a fan of the Trek movies. At that point, I don't think I'd seen much of the original series, just the odd episode on TV. And in my mind, the movies, especially Wrath of Khan, were as good, exciting, and well-made with great ILM special effects as any other cool sci-fi movies of the time. You were correct, sir. Now I can understand they probably didn't make a point of watching the movies. In their mind, Star Trek was that funny old TV show with the cheap special effects and the guy with the ears. By the way, Star Trek never had cheap effects. Never did. It just, to our modern eyes, that might look that way. And although the movies had Star Wars quality special effects and production values, to them, they just starred old people and the guy with the ears. Back then, I spent much of my free time in the local comic book store, Forbidden Planet, and other shops like that, flicking through the pages of Starlog, Cinefantastique, the official Star Trek fan club magazine, with the center pages being a catalog full of Trek goodies I couldn't order as I was in the UK. When money permitted, I would occasionally buy the odd Trek novel and the second-run DC comics, as well as some of the various fact and fiction books, making of, compendiums, tech manuals, etc. Whenever a Trek film came out, I would buy the official Star Trek Starlog magazine, the DC adaptation, the novel, the 27 by 41 sheet poster, and was the same for the likes of other stuff I loved, Batman and T2, etc. I also remember the awesome silver-covered Starlog 25th Celebration Star Trek magazine. I still have that, which was just so exciting to see in the store at the time. I was also big into the Ertl model kits. And around this time, CIC Video started producing the original series on VHS, 2 episodes per tape, and I hungrily watched every episode, many of which hadn't been seen before. I went from mild interest in Star Trek the original series to full-on obsessed. No wonder the original series hadn't gone away like other 60s sci-fi shows. Most of these episodes were absolute masterpieces, incredible stories and acting chemistry from everyone, especially Shatner, to the point you don't even notice the special effects or sets, which were never that bad anyway and now seem to have full retro future realism. The Khan episode in particular was fascinating to watch after only having seen the movie up to that point. Anyway, regarding the school business, I think it did affect me a bit. When I went to another school, I made certain the words star and Trek were never used in the same sentence. But anyway, by then, around 93 or 94-ish, I had pretty much tuned out of Trek as the version I had obsessed over, the original series, had come to an end in December 91 or February 92 for the UK. I like Next Generation, although like most, I had been pretty skeptical at first in 87 and 88. Then in the third season, I was totally won over with everyone else thanks to incredible episodes like Yesterday's Enterprise and The Best of Both Worlds. But something happened after that. I think BBC Two, who were showing The Next Generation every Wednesday or Thursday, lost the rights around the fourth or fifth season. The UK rights had gone to Sky Television, a subscriber service in the 90s, a bit like Netflix now, and I couldn't keep up to date with it anymore. So with that, in addition to the original series ending, I just tuned out of Trek almost altogether. I would sometimes check out the important episodes like Unification, Relics, or All Good Things later on when I saw them in the video store to rent, and beyond the initial announcements, checking the pilots, I had little to no interest in Deep Space Nine and Voyager, which is still the case. I know everyone says they get really good in the later seasons, but honestly, I just can't do it. Around this time, I became more interested in harder 15 or 18 rated R movies in the US, sci-fi films that I'd been too young to see previously, but was aware of them due to adverts in magazines and comics. These movies included the likes of the Alien and Predator films, Blade Runner, Total Recall, RoboCop, etc. T2 must have been around the time I began to get into the all R-rated sci-fi, as I was just old enough to see it at the cinema and became obsessed with that movie almost to the same degree as Star Trek VI. I was also rediscovering great stuff like 2001 and the Planet of the Apes series of films, which I had seen bits of but never properly watched start to finish. I even watched the Star Wars trilogy in full. I'd seen A New Hope on TV and Return of the Jedi at the cinema as a kid, but hadn't really appreciated either until I finally watched Empire Strikes Back fairly late on, around this time, the late 80s or 90s. It was around 94 I randomly picked up a sci-fi magazine, Starburst, a bit like the UK version of Starlog, and flicked through it just to see what was happening in the world of sci-fi. To my shock, there was an all-new photo of Shatner in the familiar movie uniform in what the magazine was calling Star Trek VII. I was excited and bewildered all at once. The last I knew about any Trek films being made was an article in one of my favorite unofficial books from Mark Altman and Ed Gross, The Making of Star Trek VI, which had been adapted from the great Cinefantastique Trek VI issue, where it talked about if there were to be a Trek VII, it would most certainly be with the Next Generation. Yet here it was being made with Shatner. Then I read the article and it stated it would also feature the Next Generation cast. So that really ignited my interest and got me back to full-on Trekkie mode after a 2 to 3 year hiatus. Obviously, the eventual film wasn't great. They should have spent more time getting it right, like Nimoy wanted when they approached him to direct and star. In my opinion, the movie should have been more like Yesterday's Enterprise, but without the alternate timeline TNG Klingon War stuff. But I was back. I was bad, and I was mad about Trek again. And after Star Trek Generations, I lapped up any info on the next Star Trek that was coming, initially called Star Trek Resurrection. I also then got into all the other great sci-fi stuff in the late 90s, Blade, Dark City, Fight Club, and culminating in The Matrix, which was like an awakening. Anyway, I guess my point of this letter, if there is one, other than to say hello to RMB and have him tell the world that I love Star Trek, is to say that if you get bit by the Trek bug, it's quite hard to shake it off. And even if you lose interest through lack of quality or even life events, it tends to pull you back in Michael Corleone style whenever something new and exciting happens. For me, it was Star Trek Generations. Star Trek 2009 will have done the same for many Trek fans. I was, again, after Trek had effectively bombed out with Star Trek Nemesis, Star Trek Enterprise, it was unbelievable. It was getting the huge blockbuster budget like the motion picture again, with the cool in-director of MI3 and most of all, Leonard Nimoy's return. It's going to happen again with Star Trek Picard. It's still almost unbelievable that Patrick Stewart is returning in what is almost basically a Star Trek Nemesis sequel after so much effort and money was put in to the now seemingly defunct Kelvinverse. Who's to say that coming after the dual disappointment of Star Trek Beyond, which in my opinion should have been the Shatner-Orsi Days of Future Past movie for the 50th, and Star Trek Discovery. Then, of course, there's the holy grail of anticipation in the form of the fabled Tarantino Trek movie. As a huge Tarantino fan, Pulp Fiction was the first 18-certificate film I saw at the cinema, and hearing his enthusiasm and love for the original series in various interviews, the thought of such a legendary A-list director stepping behind the camera for a Trek movie is simply mind-blowing. As are the rumors that the movie would feature Shatner in some capacity along with the JJ cast. Imagine if Spielberg or Scott or Cameron proclaimed their desire to direct a Trek film and being put into development. Amazing. If it happens, I believe it will truly lift Trek into the mainstream even more so than the previous times when Trek has toyed with mainstream appeal. As for being LOL'd out of school for loving Trek, I imagine it is not too much of a problem for geeks these days, as you frequently point out on your show. There's so much geek stuff now, and everyone is into it. Is it even geek anymore? I mean, it's kind of cool to be into all this stuff now, right? Even something like Star Trek. For example, with Abrams Star Warsing Trek in 2009 and then jumping into Star Wars himself, it's kind of blurred the Trek Star Wars lines in a way that wasn't thought possible before. This post-geek world is pretty insane now. Back in the late 90s, would anyone think there would be Star Wars sequels with Harrison Ford or Mark Hamill or Blade Runner 2 or a $200 million Star Trek movie or a fourth Mad Max and Indiana Jones film? Who could see more Ridley Scott-directed Alien movies or a multitude of Terminator sequels? The latest finally bringing back Cameron, sort of. When back in the late 90s, it looked like T3 wouldn't even get made. And what of the all-powerful MCU, etc.? On that note, who would have thought if there was a Batman versus Superman or a Justice League film, people wouldn't like them? I think the only thing left from those development hell pages in Cinescape SF universe, Sci-Fi universe, yet to be done is King Conan. So now we've got all the movies and TV we could ever imagine. A 10-part Dark Crystal prequel? Seriously? What's next? A $200 million Krull sequel? And wait, what? As I'm typing this, I see that Amazon has just announced an Event Horizon series? Plus, now we have easy access to stars on Twitter and Comic-Cons are everywhere. But at the same time, it all feels less exclusive and almost too much to keep up with, especially all the streaming. Social media and the regular Comic-Cons have seemed to make it so I can picture Shatner and Hamill less as Admiral Kirk and Luke Skywalker, but more like regular guys. The internet and eBay have basically brought the comic store direct into my home, only better. But in a strange way, I yearn for those days of yesteryear where every scrap of info was hard-earned and required trips to the comic stores to read the tantalizing rumors and updates for the new Trek in the pages of a magazine. I recall the first photos appearing, seeing everyone looking slightly different and older, the thrill of seeing the teaser poster and later the main movie poster in the cinema lobbies or in the back page of a comic. I can still remember the excitement of catching glimpses of scenes and trailers on late-night movie shows, and if I was lucky, catching the trailers before some other movie. Trek movies starring the original cast were big events and just so exciting. It was a happy time. Anyway, that was rambling, but maybe I just wanted to say hello to you, Rob, add my voice to the letters, and say I love your YouTube show. You're a fellow geek, Pete in the UK. Well, Pete, indeed, that was a long, rambling letter, but I loved it. And you know why I loved it? Because I love hearing people's journeys to be members of this, the Post-Geek Singularity. I hope everyone else did. I encourage you to send me letters of what was your journey to becoming an imagination connoisseur? How'd you get into it? You know, I'm always curious to hear that story or those stories. It was great to hear your story. I really enjoyed that. It was what a terrific letter. And now, to keep on that sort of track, and this is a shorter one, but it's also about what do you do with your fandom? And this comes from Ian Samuels, who's written before, but he's writing again. Rob, writing is important to me. It's an important part of who I am. It started as an outlet for my overactive imagination, but I have discovered that it is also useful in other ways. I've always been a huge Batman fan, and I did not like what was happening to Batman on the big screen. Batman Forever and Batman and Robin were terrible. Both Val Kilmer and George Clooney did not do a good job as Batman. Not entirely their fault, because the writing was bad. By the way, I'm totally going to buy those hot toys of Batman and Robin. from Batman Forever. Another thing was in Batman Forever, in Batman 1989, we saw Billy D. Williams as Harvey Dent, and Harvey had a terrible accident and turned into Tommy Lee Jones. Then we eventually got Christopher Nolan's trilogy, and what gave me issue was Christian Bale's ridiculous, croaky Batman voice. If only someone to Bale to one side, if only someone on one side of Christian Bale said to him, "What the hell are you doing? Whatever it is, don't." At least with Batfleck and Batman v Superman, they showed him using a voice changer. Anyway, I came to realize as a writer that the things I didn't like, I could change. I did not like the changes DC made for the New 52 reboot of their universe, so I ignored them for my fan fiction. At first, I tried a collection of 5 stories to see how it would work and released it on Amazon. 5 Nights in Gotham. And my Kindle sales are pretty good. So I decided to do a follow-up of 5 other stories called Darkest Nights and combine them all 10 stories together as Batman Collected. It made me feel a little powerful for a short amount of time. If I didn't like something, I could just write my own version. But I also discovered when I had alternative storyline ideas that hadn't been done, I could write those too. It is true when people say the pen is mightier than the sword. Writing is a powerful tool. As has been shown, good writing can make a series or a movie just as much as bad writing can kill a series or a movie. I just thought I would share how powerful it can be. Be afraid. Be very afraid. Or not. Your choice, Ian. Well, Ian, again, another great story of how people use fandom. I love hearing those stories. I didn't know that you were writing. I know that I'd be curious. Did you write those stories and you were able to sell them on Kindle? Because I know that there was a fan fiction thing they were allowing people to do if you worked in the universe somehow. I don't know much about how that all worked, but it sounds pretty interesting. I'd like to hear more about it. Vegetable Tube, very generous for the support of the channel. Vegetable Tube, thank you for that. First of all, Vegetable Tube says, why don't Starfleet officers wear protective uniforms or gear to lessen injuries in battle? There's always a computer console exploding, hull breaches, etc. Starfleet has the technology to protect their people. Well, that's probably a good question. I would like to think that while they haven't really gotten into it, I think that, first of all, remember, Starfleet ships are exploratory vessels. They're not battleships. I mean, because we're seeing stories that have lots of battle or conflict in them, we tend to see more often than not those kinds of things happening. Exploding consoles, conflict with alien races. But I think for the most part, with as vast as the cosmos is, it's probably pretty, I don't know. I wouldn't call it boring, but exploring the universe is probably not the most exciting job in the world, I guess, unless you're a true explorer and would love it. By the way, having Kirk being bored in Star Trek Beyond was borderline offensive. But I think you're right. I think it's a good point. I mean, why wouldn't people wear? I'd like to think that Starfleet fabric must be a little. They probably are some kind of resilience. Maybe I didn't like it in Star Trek 2 when you saw these pea coats and these thick wool jackets. I thought that was a little silly. The one thing I liked about Star Trek: The Motion Picture is it seemed, a la Next Generation, that you would have to be in a comfortable environment. And that's why those clothes seem more practical on long-term space voyages. You'd want to be in something that was comfortable and also allowed you to do your work. But I agree. They need to protect their people. Why weren't there seatbelts as we finally got them in Star Trek: The Motion Picture? I mean, it's a very good point that you mentioned that going into battle and going through, say, ion storms and things like that, it didn't seem like Starfleet vessels were exactly the most safe places to be. I think that was dramatic license, but yeah. But that's a great point well taken. And you know what? As I say, there should be more verisimilitude when it comes to that. I really believe that. I think you're right. Suthius is here. Wow, Suthius, you also, thank you for the generous support of the channel. Suthius says, hey, Mr. B, are you into YouTube food or travel shows? Food Ranger, Migrationology, The Best Food Review Show, and Strictly Dumpling are my go-tos. I find it fascinating when people make their living off of traveling and eating. Suthius, first of all, No, I'm not into YouTube shows, but I do watch a lot of Netflix, either travel documentaries, food documentaries. I like Jon Favreau's new chef documentary series, which I really liked. Also, I love renovation documentaries, like when people travel, or I don't know which show it is, but like when Brits go to Europe to try and find a retirement house to build or a vacation house to build. I love those shows. But I think you've hit on something that is more which is important. When you said you find it fascinating when people make their living off traveling and eating, like Anthony Bourdain, Parts Unknown. I think a lot of the world, most of the world, not enough of the world, more Europeans, certainly Americans. I've heard that statistic that 65% of Americans, it used to be like 85% 30 years ago, but 65% of Americans don't have passports, which means they don't travel, which is one of, I think, the great problems with our culture here in the US. I think the reason people love travel shows and food shows is because we all get to live vicariously through them. We don't, as Americans, travel enough. We don't have enough adventure in our lives. And I think when you're watching, when you watch travel shows or food shows, it really gives you an opportunity to check out other cultures and to live vicariously through others. As I've talked before, like in the early 60s, when the Bond franchise became popular, I really believe, and I think one of the things the Bond films did for the culture back in the early 60s was, especially for Americans, it provided this jet set lifestyle in these exotic locations that most Americans hadn't been to. Even in Goldfinger, what was it, the Fortinbras? Is that the name of the hotel that's in Goldfinger? Unless you'd been to Miami Beach, you wouldn't have seen it. And I think that one of the great things, we always talk about, social media, the great, it's such a problem. But on the other hand, the World Wide Web, the internet, has been one of the greatest forces of communication, and it really has brought the world together in ways we've never seen before. The fact that you can FaceTime, we truly have video phones, what we used to think of as science fiction, we carry around in our pockets. And I think one of the great things is when, I love it when people go travel. I'll watch anything where someone's traveling to someplace I haven't been, and they show me whether it's small houses or whether it's the food they're eating. Always very, very exciting. And I can't get enough. And I think that's why people are addicted. Now, I haven't watched any of the shows that you mentioned. And for those, let me bring them up. Suthius says, Food Ranger, Migrationology, the best food review show, and Strictly Dumpling are his go-tos. What are yours? But I think that's why people do it. I think it's a great point. I thank you for bringing it up. And I think that's one of the great joys of social media, is to be able to share our experiences. Hell, that's what this channel is all about. Remember what I say, every person you meet has a story to tell you haven't heard yet, you have yet to hear. Well, that's what the great thing about YouTube shows is. People get to show you things and tell you things, or give you experiences that you have yet to hear or experience. And that's what's so great about YouTube. Well, Suthius, I want to thank you for that. Thanks for supporting the channel in the way you have. That was very generous. But I'm going to have to check out these YouTube shows. Migrationology is a great title. So I think I absolutely would watch that show. So, yeah. Now, I have another letter, and this is a short one. It comes from John D. John D writes, and this is about The Lion King. This is a change of pace. John D says, Rob, this is a sort of follow-up to a comment Chris had on the John Campea show yesterday, which was yesterday, Tuesday, where she complained about the cats in the movie Cats not having buttholes. I may be wrong, but I don't think you saw the new Lion King remake. I have not seen it yet, I know. My wife and I have, but why couldn't they have something alluding to their junk, but not truly show it? Or if that doesn't work, why do we need to have the main characters on their backs or wriggling around and making it so obvious that something is missing? John D. Well, John, I have not heard this. I guess you're trying to tell me that the male animals in The Lion King, as photorealistic as they are missing a scrotum or sex organs. There's no, well, let's face it, they don't have any penises and they've got no balls. And I guess that the women, the female characters don't have those beautiful flowers that we all wish we were spending a lot more time in, and then we're not. Are you telling me that the animals in Lion King don't have these things? I think that's odd. That's very strange to me. That where's the verisimilitude in that? I mean, that is odd. If you were watching, that would really bother me. I haven't seen Lion King yet. As I've said, in America, Paul Verhoeven told me this at the 1985 Seattle International Film Festival, the closing night party. He talked to me how he was very upset by the fact that in America, you can kill everybody you want. You can put as much blood on the screen as you want, but you show people touching a bare breast or actually, God forbid, having sex, and Americans tune out. Like, apparently the world can't know that there are balls and sex organs on animals. That's really strange. You're the first person to bring it up. I don't even know what to say about that. You know what? That is not peak verisimilitude. But it's very interesting. I didn't know that. That's very strange to me. Like, I would think that if that were the case and they're going to have an animal roll around, that would be something that would just be there as par for the course. How interesting. You spend all this time to create photorealistic animals, except not only are they neutered or spayed or whatever, they just don't have anything at all. That's very odd. I don't know what to say about that. Other than that my verisimilitude, as the gatekeeper of verisimilitude, I would say that's bad. I don't like that. That's odd. That would stick out to me. I'm so behind on movies. I need to go catch up. I'm just behind. Suthius continues on. Suthius says, getting a passport is not hard. My family has them. It's the time and money that most of us are having difficulties with. I agree with you. Sure, you'll find cheap airfare, but you'll rather pull out your hair instead. Look, I'm a huge proponent of traveling. You learn more traveling to some place you've never been than anything in the world. And all I can say is that I think a lot of people get really stressed out about the idea of leaving your comfort zone. Let me tell you that there is nothing more fun than to travel to a foreign country. You get out, you come into the airport. Everything is new. All the people look different. Every place you go, there's a singular joy. Just let go of the idea that anything bad's going to happen. Just take it all in. Every little detail. The first place I ever went to in Europe was Spain. The world premiere of my film Free Enterprise was at the Sitges Film Festival in October of 1998. And I'd never been to Europe before, and it was just everything about it. It was just a joy. Going through the tunnels, seeing the big fans in the tunnels. I'm like, wow, there's fans in the tunnels. Keep the air moving, I guess, so people don't get too hot and stagnant or whatever. Everything about going to Spain was the greatest thing in the world. I loved it so much. Every street sign looked different. Every road looked different. Everything was different. Loved it so much. Please, everybody, go travel. It's not that expensive. And if you think about it, I'm always talking about, we're all going to, all of you are invited. I can't pay for you because I'm trying to afford it myself, but going to accept Detective Jim. We're going to get Detective Jim. Detective Jim has never flown out of the country before, except to the Bahamas. Detective Jim, one of our great moderators, we're dragging him to London. We're taking him to Old Blighty. We're going to sit down with Terry. We're going to hoist a few pints, and we're going to go to drink lots of whiskey or whatever. And we're going to go see Bond 25. You're all invited. We're all going to see it at the Leicester Square, the Odeon Cinema, when it opens. We're all going. You got to travel. And look at it this way. Even if you don't have a passport, wherever you live, within 2 hours of you, whether it's north, south, east, or west, within 2 hours of you, there's a place you haven't been. It might be a small town, might be the beach. I don't know what it is. But within 2 hours of you, here's what you should do. Here's my homework. Here's Robservations homework. Wherever you live, in the next couple weeks, this weekend, coming weekend, or make it this weekend, because why wait? Just look at a map. Find out what's 2 hours from you that you've never been to. I bet there's a place. Do a little research. Find what's the best restaurant. Local. Don't eat at a chain. Eat at some mom and pop place, something that's local. Get up at 6 a.m., right? Get up at 6 a.m. And if you know the drive is 2 hours, give yourself a half an hour to get in the car and drive those 2 hours, and you're going to get to wherever the hell you're going by 8:30 for breakfast. And just go explore that town. Go somewhere you haven't been. Go talk to people. Go talk to the people who work in the restaurant. Maybe it's a diner, maybe it's a pub, wherever it is that you're going. Just somewhere 2 hours from you, there's a place you've never been. Go on an adventure. Report back. Take pictures. We'll make a special Imagination Connoisseur gallery. Imagination Connoisseur Adventures. Right now, Mike Bond's going, great. I have to do something else on the website. Imagination Connoisseur Adventures. That's a bad title. We'll come up with something else. No, you know what? The Imagination Connoisseur Excursions, or the Imagination Connoisseur Away Team, whatever. We'll call it something. And just have an adventure, even if it's only 2 hours from your house. Write about where, first of all, tell us where you live, where you're going, and go take some pictures of wherever it is. They might have some weird festival, like whether it's a wine festival or a whiskey festival or a strawberry festival. I don't know what it is, but just do 2 hours from your house, wherever you live now, your apartment, wherever. Go 2 hours, take a day excursion. Do it this weekend. Report back. But you're right, Suthius. I mean, traveling, you don't have to travel across the world. 2 hours from your house. Everybody, there's a place 2 hours from where you live right now that you've never been. Everybody should go. That's what I think. Wouldn't that be fun? I mean, actually, it would be fun. I'm going to do it. Although it's Southern California, I've already done that so many times. Maybe I'll find a place. Maybe I'll lead and I'll do a live chat from it. Cardinal Sin says, R&B, your thoughts, R.E. Taboo with Tom Hardy. I love first of all, you know who loved Taboo is John Schnepp. John Schnepp always talked about Taboo, and he loved it. I've only seen a few episodes. I watched like the first 3. It's great. I love Taboo. I thought Taboo was awesome, but that's one of the shows I got to get in. Elizabeth and I should binge watch it from the beginning. But what I saw is great. Really well made, really atmospheric, a lot of verisimilitude in that show, and Tom Hardy it's awesome. So yes, it's a show I need to watch, if only to honor the great John Schnepp. Suthius says, nothing like walking along a pond where bamboo toilet stalls are hovering above when all of a sudden you slip into said pond. Yep, Vietnam, 93. So truly, as many Vietnam veterans would say, you were in the shit. Yeah, that's probably not the best place to be. But you know what? You get to share it with all of us, Suthius. And again, always good to have those adventures, to be able to relate to those to other people. JB Bonifacio says, it's been reported by Variety that Disney have had internal talks about allowing Deadpool to be PG-13 for MCU appearances and rated R for solo films. Well, we were talking about that on the John Campea show. Look, Deadpool was not always R-rated in the comics. As somebody pointed out, I was reading this yesterday. I don't know if it was on Twitter or not, that Deadpool, for the most part, has been a PG-13 character that was only allowed to be R-rated in the comics. I think that could be true. It really depends. I mean, Ryan Reynolds is funny. I don't necessarily think you have to have something be R-rated, but part of, I think, the appeal of Deadpool is in a world of very earnest comic book adaptations. It was an antidote. Deadpool is very punk rock. It's very bawdy. There's a lot of sexual humor, and there's some incredible violence that makes it a lot of fun. That's not to say that look, Ryan Reynolds is a very compelling actor. He's a very magnetic personality all the way back. I've loved Ryan Reynolds all the way back to Van Wilder. I think he's great, and he could pull off a PG-13 Deadpool. The thing is, I really like the idea that the Deadpool character gets pegged by his girlfriend on International Women's Day. I like that he just eviscerates the Yakuza, at the end of his swords. I mean, I like all that. It makes it fun. Deadpool, the way they've introduced him, for better or for worse, that's what makes him a $700 million to $800 million lead actor in a movie, a lead character in a movie. So, it could be. I mean, I could see him be in solo films. I just, once you start watering down that character, you're going to water it down. Then it becomes like, we don't have to make him R-rated. But you know what? You can't say that, well, it'd be more profitable if it was for kids. Would it? Would it though? I mean, Deadpool, that's a lot of money. Deadpool has brought in a lot of cash. But it'd be interesting. I'm sure they want to figure out how to do that, because why not? But you know what? If kids start digging Deadpool in PG-13 or MCU films, and they get Deadpool 1 and 2. And if you're like a 13 or 14-year-old and you're watching Deadpool 1 or Deadpool 2 and your parents catch you watching it, you might get in trouble. Now I get to the last letter of the day. This comes from one of our moderators. See, you know what? As much as I love our moderators, they don't necessarily curry favor with me. They still have to write letters too. They can't just talk about what they want. And I don't even agree with this letter, and I'm going to read it anyway because it's from Terry. Terry from the UK. And Terry Flynn, our main man, and old Blighty, has written this letter. And he's written this letter about the movie, the documentary on Netflix that I've talked about a lot, The Great Hack, which I really like. Terry, not so much. But that's what makes the world go round. And we here at the Post-Geek Singularity, we Imagination Connoisseurs, we can disagree in a civil manner. So, and that's why I think it's important for me to read dissenting letters from somebody, my own moderator, who's taking me to task, who does not agree with what I had to say, nor does he agree with the movie I told him to watch. So here it comes. Dear Rob, I just watched The Great Hack on Netflix, partly due to your recommendation. I'm sorry, but it didn't work for me at all. As an alternative universe quasi-horror drama, then fine. But as a quasi-documentary, it sucked. Cambridge Analytica did lots wrong. I don't wish to invite lawsuits, but the role Facebook had looks very dodgy. But this is where things go awry. The effects, if any, were marginal to the elections in both the UK and the US. Those of us who have PhDs and who have studied philosophical trends, voting, and the timelines of major countries over the ages never expected the outcomes to be anything but what we both got. Change deliberately in inverted commas could only come from a narrow segment of the population, one that has been systematically marginalized by left and right who had no interest in Facebook, no matter what it said. I correctly predicted the downfall of Prime Minister May's government in terms of a majority at the last general election using a Nobel Prize-winning survey. News outlets disbelieved me, so I simply went to a bookmaker and made a win when I, unlike all the other so-called experts, predicted right. I also knew Trump would beat Hillary if those two ended up as the candidates. I just know the feelings of 90% of us who feel left behind. Exploring the use of Facebook to look at the 5% or so who might change views is all very well, but to be honest, they were irrelevant from the get-go. So this quasi-documentary lacks basic verisimilitude. Having lived away from my hometown since 1991, I returned to see abruptly and highly worryingly that things were wrong. And those are not social media people. The problems run far deeper. Who is the right-wing candidate? Who is the left-wing one? What are their respective solutions to the fact that my city has regressed over 30 years? We think we are Metropolis, but in fact, we are Gotham. Facebook and Cambridge Analytica is an interesting drama for those who like the idea that small changes will solve things. But sorry, I don't buy that. I'm no Marxist, but his analysis of capitalism was spot on. Indeed, the Jews in the ancient texts of the Torah knew the problem and how to solve it with 7-year debt jubilees. We are sadly living in a Battlestar Galactica world doomed to repeat our mistakes. Maybe we'll learn one day, but I'm afraid a Netflix quasi-documentary sheds no real light on the issues. Kind regards, Terry. Well, I mean, Terry, I can't discount what you're saying because I don't think you're wrong, but I also don't think, look, when I was watching The Great Hack, whether or not Facebook or Cambridge Analytica played as big a role as this documentary insinuates they did in both Brexit and Donald Trump's election, I think that there was a much larger issue at play in the documentary. I mean, clearly, as was very well illustrated, you're talking about the results of things, but I'm talking about, as we know from Alexander Nix, the head of Cambridge Analytica's TED Talk, which I've watched, and we know from the way that they were using this data, the real threat is, I think, coming soon. It's not about what's already happened. As a matter of fact, I hand it to Cambridge Analytica for using data in a different manner, collecting data, harvesting data in real time from people just by putting out Facebook queries or Facebook surveys that they could take information from. And remember, the only people that they were interacting with were the people that were using Facebook. It's not the people that weren't using Facebook. They were using the people that were on social media. They're the ones that were so easily manipulated. But what's frightening to me about what they talk about in The Great Hack, for instance, with all of the data coming out, and you're carrying around a supercomputer that's broadcasting how much exercise you do. We don't even know. You know, you can watch YouTube videos to say which apps you should turn off on your phones, your iPhones, for instance. I had no idea just how much data that I was broadcasting. But what's going to happen is, how is it going to be used in the future? Like, what if someone looks at my Amazon buy list for the last 20 years? All the books I've bought, all the movies I've bought, and using AI or any AI technology, they can develop a sociological and a psychological profile of me based on the books I've read and the movies that I've seen. And I think it's the how this data is being collected and how it's being used. What if, because I have a predilection of loving Bruce's Candy Kitchen cinnamon saltwater taffy, and they know how much of it I either get through the mail or how much people send to me or how many times I mention it on social media, they can be like, okay, there's this much sugar in a 3-pound bag of cinnamon saltwater taffy, and they base my medical coverage on whether or not I've eaten that taffy. And they say that, well, if he likes that, then he has a preponderance of liking these kinds of sweets. And by taking in so much, that might affect whether or not I'm even issued or allowed to get health insurance. I think the point of The Great Hack is the fact that we ourselves have become the greatest commodity. All of the data that's coming away from us or out of us. And I do think, I mean, I don't think in your letter you're giving enough credit towards, I mean, you could say that, look, I tend to agree. You could easily have predicted Trump was going to win the election. I felt that he was going to win the election. Hillary was not a very good candidate. And I would watch her, and every time I saw Hillary speak, I'm like, I really want you to win, but you're not going to win the way you're presenting yourself. You know, you're coming off as my grandmother or mother that I listen to and I respect, but you're kind of an old fuddy-duddy. You want somebody who's, we don't have politicians anymore that are brash and dynamic. And I think Donald Trump, in the case of Donald Trump, appealed to a certain demographic of people that wanted a superficial candidate that projected a certain thing, and they bought into that, even though, you know, he had no experience. But I think you're not giving enough credit into how social media is working, and whether you're talking about philosophical statistics or whatever you put it, I think there's a lot going on here with people being able to use the data that's just out there. And I go back to thinking about, it wasn't a crime what they did, how they were manipulating us, but they were manipulating us. We're being manipulated all the time. Before social media, we were manipulated by advertising. We've always been manipulated en masse. The public's points of view, and for hundreds of years. And I think the Great Hack's point is that what we haven't done is we haven't figured out how we are going to deal with a world in which our data, which each individual person is broadcasting on a daily basis, 24/7, even when you're sleeping, how you're sleeping is being broadcast, can be utilized by third parties and turned against you. And I think these are moral and ethical questions that we're going to have to deal with as we move into the 21st century. How does this data, is our personal information protected? Now, whether you believe that Cambridge Analytica had an effect on the elections and the Brexit vote, maybe it did, maybe it didn't. But the overall point of that documentary, I think, is chilling in the fact that big data is we're giving away all this data, and it can be used by anybody. Cambridge Analytica won't be the first. They're certainly not the last. And they're the only ones that had this kind of a documentary made about them. Wait till the medical companies. Wait till we find out how people's medical coverage is being manipulated based on the data that's been collected on them for the last 20 years. Genetic information, 23andMe. Wait till we find out that whatever genetic services you're using to find out about your siblings, who's to say they haven't been giving away your genetic data or collecting an X-Files-esque database on all of our genetic makeups that are going to be used for all kinds of health concerns. I mean, it's amazing. We are giving away our data that can be used or mined by any company that they would normally be paying millions of dollars to acquire, and we're just giving it all away. And that's what I think that if nothing else, the great hack makes you realize that we ourselves, each one of us, possess very valuable data that can be constantly cultivated and in real time. And we're not being compensated, nor do we even know what we're doing. We don't even know. And I think that was the big point of that documentary. And I think it's a really important documentary. I don't think it's a pseudo documentary at all. I think it really was examining issues. Look at the reporter. I forget her name, but they added her. What's interesting about the Great Hack documentary is when they were making it, it's nothing like how it started out. It started out as a completely different kind of a documentary, but based on events and what was going on when they started making it, it went through a metamorphosis and became the documentary that you saw. So I think there's a lot. I don't disagree with you that it might not be entirely correct in terms of it seems to be taking too much credit for the Brexit vote and Trump's election. But I think the overarching message of the documentary is very well taken, and it's very chilling, and it's something we can remember. I mean, all of this data that we're broadcasting can be used against us at any time. And that's what I thought that the documentary was most interesting and sort of that overall point of view. But I could be wrong. Suthius again says something. 2 hours to the North Washington. Oh, Suthius says 2 hours to North Washington, D.C., 2 hours to East Virginia Beach and Chesapeake Bay, 2 hours to the West Appalachian Mountains, 2 hours to South North Carolina. Well, Suthius, where are you going to go? Where are you going to go? Report back. I want to know where you're headed. As a matter of fact, where are you all headed? I want to know. I think let's take an adventure this weekend, people. We're the adventure team, all of us. And on that note, I'm going to bring this chat to an end. This was a fun chat, a lot of different letters, a lot of interesting things that you people said. I want to thank you for that. Everyone's journeys. I love these diverse chats. It's great. So thank everyone. Not thank everyone. Thank all of your fellow Imagination Connoisseurs. Thank all of you people in the live chats. I thank my moderators, Jim, Terry. Thanks for the letter, Terry, as well. The Honorable Mayor, Mr. Bodden. And, of course, Greg Smith up in Olympia, Washington. By the way, Greg Smith's daughter, his first number one daughter, I believe, turned 17, Greg. So tell her congratulations on her birthday. And congratulations to you. It's been a year since we came up there and filmed you. By the way, if you want to meet Greg Smith up close and personal, look at the one and only episode of Robservations. Not the live chat, but the episodes. It's all been a year. It's crazy. But I want to thank all of you. Thank you, everybody, for supporting the channel by supporting the website at theburnettwork.net and through Super Chats. I really appreciate that. It keeps everything going, keeps the website expanding, which is terrific. So thank you for that. If you want to join up, you can become an Imagination Connoisseur and join the website, support the website for $1 a year. $1 a year. That's a fraction. Think about that. How much entertainment value you can get for $1. And you can go up to the website and you can yell at anybody whose letters I've read and tell them they're wrong or tell them they're right and tell us your own story. Add to the Imagination Connoisseur gallery. Now we have to have a new gallery, Imagination Connoisseur Adventures or wherever. I like the 2-hour challenge. It's the 2-hour challenge. Tell us, where are we going? 2 hours from where you are. But anyway, I'm going to say this brings an end to Robservations chat number 190, which is crazy. I want to thank Lucky Tiger Men's Grooming Products for those men who want to look and feel great for sponsoring these chats and for sponsoring the website, theburnettwork.net. If you go to getluckytiger.com, you know, if you buy any of their products, you can punch in PGS for Post-Geek Singularity when you check out for 20% off your order. So I'm bringing this chat to an end. I will be back tomorrow. I am not on the John Campea show tomorrow. I'm not on the John Campea show until Tuesday because he's going out of town. He's on tomorrow, but then he's going to Canada. He's going to Canada to see his family, but I'm not on until Tuesday. Voices carry. Anyway, I want to say goodbye. And remember, every person you meet, especially when you go 2 hours from your house, every person you meet has a story to tell that you have yet to hear, and all you have to do is listen. And with that, I bid you farewell. And as always, have a better day.